Minutes to allow some other members to join, but thank you again for your time. And we're looking forward to tonight's discussion. Okay, I think we've got an audience building up here, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Ali Tejani. I'm a radiology resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, and we're here today for the ACR AI Journal Club. And thank you again for your time, and we're really hoping to have an exciting discussion with our expert panelists. But before that, let's quickly review some goals and objectives for our talk today. So as we mentioned, the ACR AI Journal Club is a monthly journal club available for all our members, and this event takes place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time once a month. So keep an eye out for those announcements. As you registered for the webinar, you'll have similar opportunities in the future as well. The recordings will be available on YouTube shortly after this session. And if you haven't already, go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter at these Twitter handles that you see, and to keep up to date with the latest in going on with the ACR Data Science Institute. And just a couple of ground rules before we get started. So if you could use the chat box for any comments, and then use the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your screen for any questions closer to our Q&A panel. Also, just a heads up that the Data Science Institute does offer a blog, and we'd love to have you with our community. Keep an eye out for quarterly briefings to keep up to date with the latest content, and also to find other events like this webinar to stay more involved with the ACR and the Data Science Institute. For this talk, we'll be discussing the considerations for AI purchasing process, so looking at performance, infrastructure, financial, and quality and safety considerations. We'll go over a quick checklist for AI purchasing considerations, and then, of course, save as much time as possible for our expert panel. And it is my pleasure, my honor to introduce our expert panel. They're so generous to be here with us and to give us their time. Dr. Ross Filice from MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, Dr. John Mongan from the University of California, San Francisco, and Dr. Marc Kohli, also from the University of California, San Francisco. So this is the paper we're going to talk about today from the JACR in 2020, evaluating artificial intelligence systems to guide purchasing decisions. For some background here, purchasing an AI solution requires a critical approach. And so, as you can imagine, it's a complex process, and it really all starts with having a well-defined clinical problem. So really wanting to identify a pain point, whether it's a workflow inefficiency, a computer vision problem, or an issue with resource optimization, for some examples. You want to recruit stakeholders and form a team of champions as you go forward, and really having a multidisciplinary team to have all those perspectives. And you want to do your homework, and that's pretty vague, I understand. So let's take a look at what this means in a little more detail. It all starts with the initial evaluation. And real quick, if you do want to pull up the paper, you can follow along. But the points that you will see all come from that initial paper as part of this journal club. So for the first part, let's talk about the initial evaluation. You really want to leverage existing literature. So taking a look at dataset characteristics, looking at performance characteristics, performance metrics, understanding what those mean in the context of the study or the task at hand, determining whether the appropriate metrics were used, and whether the data set itself represents the population that you intend to that you hope to help with the AI model. Next, thinking always about how to practically integrate the AI model into clinical workflow, thinking about the need for fine-tuning any models on local data, assessing whether there's an external validation, all kind of getting at the idea of generalizability, thinking down the line about processes for ongoing monitoring, thinking about the costs associated with these, and of course, keeping in mind the bias, any sources of bias, whether it's in the data set, in the process of developing the model, or whether in the way the model is deployed, should always be at the forefront of these discussions. And of course, asking for help, it's always important to recruit experts, statisticians, ethicists, clinicians, and informaticists, people who have domain expertise to contribute to the decision-making process. And talking to existing customers, I thought was a really important point from this paper, taking a look at what their experiences have been like. Has the model been stable? Has there been good communication with the vendor? How has their response time been? How has it been integrating their tool into their existing infrastructure, and talking about any experience with updates or new technology and what that looks like from a financial standpoint, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Quick image here of just how you may see AI results. One point made in this paper is that the AI results can be quite heterogeneous. You may see different forms of AI results and how they're shown, how they're stored in the archive available at your institution or at your practice. As you can see here, this is just an example of a heat map that gives you a better idea of the information that the model is using to make its decision. And so it's always good to keep in mind the options provided by your vendor, because there's no one size fits all, and chances are things will be different from vendor to vendor. On that note, thinking about the infrastructure considerations. So is the tool a standalone application? Is it a best of breed approach, as they say, or is it a tool that's offered with an AI platform where other vendors can also run their models as well? And is the tool vendor agnostic? Is this a tool that requires ongoing processes for safety considerations, for technical considerations, or is it a one process fits all model? Coordinating with the IT team is of utmost importance, making sure that they're in from the ground stage, looking at considerations for new interfaces, considerations for having on-prem versus cloud storage. And on the note of storage of AI results particularly, are you incorporating AI results as secondary captures, as structured reports? Who can access the AI results? Is it embargoed before the clinicians see AI results as well? These are hot topics as well that often require consideration prior to deployment. And are there tools in place for auditing and taking a look at some of the key performance indicators? Are there business solution tools available to help with this process of ongoing monitoring, which was a theme in this paper, the importance of continuous monitoring of our tools throughout the life cycle. So as you mentioned, a couple more considerations here for continuous monitoring and business intelligence solutions. And so here's a brief figure demonstrating sample infrastructure that can support AI. So as you can see, there's no one size fits all. And I think that's the importance of this paper, is considering all your options and all the paradigms out there and things that may have changed since then as well. And so we talked about a best of breed approach, in which you may see the top row as a configuration where AI models are selected independently based on their performance, their functionality, their use case that they apply to. Or you can think about a platform model where you have a smaller number of integrations, as you can see. Now, keep in mind that their limitation here is that you're often limited in the choice of applications that are available to you. And the example in the paper was that very salient in the sense that there's an analogy with like having an iPhone or an Android app device, where you're limited in the applications that you can use depending on your service and your provider. Moving on to financial considerations. So keeping in mind the business model, are you and your institution looking at a per click model where financial considerations need to take into consideration the volume of studies, the number of times a radiologist will apply the tool, or a subscription or a flat rate model, which tends to be less common than the former? And then always get to ask about updates. Are these included, or is there an additional cost? How often are the updates available? It's important to keep these points very clear at the beginning of the conversation to make sure that there's communication and understanding with the vendor. And then a topic that's personally my favorite was return on investment, and keeping in mind those key performance indicators. it can be tough to define these sometimes. And some of these, while we do like to use objective metrics to measure some of these, it can be hard for concepts like quality improvement. Do we have business intelligence solutions that can monitor KPIs? What about soft return on investment? How do we measure concepts such as radiologist satisfaction and well-being, decreasing burnout, contract stability with hospitals, overall cost in the healthcare system? Can be a little more objective, but again, a bit of a more complex topic. The idea of patient outcomes, which can vary and be quite heterogeneous as well. And then taking a look at having dashboards to monitor these over a long period of time, making sure that your algorithm is performing as intended and that you are keeping those endpoints in mind at all times. Moving on to quality and safety considerations. Is there infrastructure and governance for continuous monitoring? Again, you may notice that this has come up quite a bit, and that should emphasize the importance of really having a process, a plan ahead of time prospectively for monitoring your model's performance, for data drift, for any kind of any sort of impaired performance that can hurt the patient population ultimately. And then, of course, bias considerations. We have studies, we have real life examples of how bias inherent to AI models can be exacerbated, specifically exacerbating healthcare disparities in the data set. And then another thing to think about is who has access to AI solutions. Is there a discrepancy in the population that may have AI involved in their care and the implications that they may have? Again, getting to the idea of disproportionate bias, the demographics that are represented. I'll give you an example here. For example, if you have a model that's trained on a tertiary academic university hospital center, is it appropriate to then apply that model to a county safety net hospital or critical care center where the demographics may vary, the patient population may vary with respect to those considerations, ultimately leading to differences in AI performance. And again, just the last theme I'd want to emphasize here is really emphasizing that this is all about teamwork and having a multidisciplinary team. So getting your informatics, quality improvement, and safety leadership involved early in the process. Here's a checklist from the paper, which brilliantly summarizes the points that we've talked about and the salient points in the paper as well. So I urge you to go back and take a look at this. We'll talk more about this in the next 40 minutes or so. And with that, I really would like to focus on our question and answer session with the expert panel. So thank you again to Dr. Filice, Dr. Mongan, and Dr. Kohli. One quote that I really love from the paper was that the AI tool must work synergistically with the radiologist without hampering their efficiency or capability. One thing to keep in mind from everything we talked about is that we have to have the user in mind too, right? In terms of, well, deploying a model, how will that affect their day-to-day operations? Are we introducing more clicks? Are we introducing a more burdensome process than intended to originally? So with that, I'll stop there. I think our panelists are here with us. And again, just a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box, and we can save our chat box for any kind of comments. If there are no questions, I have plenty that can go well beyond the hour, so no worries there. So quick chance here for our attendees. Any burning questions? Okay, to get things started then, I'd like to ask you all. I'm going to pull up this checklist just real quick. So this is the checklist in 2020. Since then, are there any salient points that you'd like to add based on changes in the field or from personal experience working with vendors since that time?
So I can jump in, and my colleagues may have things that they would want to add. I'd say from my perspective, I don't think that there's necessarily anything that I would add so much as that it's become clear to me that there's some of the things that were already there that I think it's become even more clear how important they are. And for me, the main thing that has become really clear to me that is really important and that I think oftentimes gets missed is the one that's right up there at the top about really understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve and making sure that you actually have a problem that you're trying to solve, and that AI solution is a solution to a problem that you have. Because I think that all too often, people get caught up in all these other considerations and in the technology and in we want to be able to say that we've deployed something that's AI, and they put something out that's not necessarily a solution to a problem that they have. So I think it's really important that you make sure that you're solving a problem you have, and recognize that not all practices have the same problems. So AI solutions don't necessarily have universal value across all practices. Something that works really well in my practice because it solves a particular problem for me may not work well in someone else's practice where they don't have that same problem.
Yeah, John, just to add another thing there to the checklist, I think it's unpacking that final bullet item in the checklist. And that is really about thinking hard about what happens if the algorithm doesn't work as it's intended. And two concepts that, two words that I just want to repeat that you've started to bring to the forefront here, which are, what is the discoverability for the person who is the human in the loop, or maybe outside of the loop of that AI error? And then what is the correctability for someone that is in that out of the loop? And those are things that are really very specific to the each individual use case, but have kind of give you two tests to think about the quality and safety impacts.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Mark. I think that kind of fits in under a broader category for me of risk, which I think is something that we touched on in this paper. But when I hear people talking about evaluating AI, I oftentimes hear about cost benefit analysis. And so people are looking at the total cost of ownership versus the benefits. And I think on that cost side, it's important to, as you're pointing out there, really consider the risks as well as the costs. And I think a lot of that has to do with, for that particular use case or that particular integration, as you're saying, like, what happens when it gets it wrong? Not just what's the performance, how often is it going to give a right answer, how often is it going to give a wrong answer, but projecting forward what's likely to happen when the AI comes up with the wrong answer.
Dr. Filice, was there anything that you think that you'd add to this checklist?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with John that I don't think a lot has changed. It's just that some of these things have become even more important. Yeah, I totally agree with him on that. The two things that I sort of think of that are sort of challenging and are difficult to handle are the infrastructure for these tools. And I think you sort of need a plan as if you're going to have more than one, right? So we talked a little bit about how there's different options on how to deploy or integrate a bunch of different tools into your practice. But I think you have to think about that no matter what from the very beginning, because you're likely going to want to use more than one tool, probably from more than one vendor. And so you kind of have to have a plan for how to accomplish that. And then the ongoing monitoring after the fact, that can start as soon as sort of a pilot to try and show that a tool works well on your own data. But even beyond the pilot, it's really important, I think, and I think John and Mark would agree, to continually monitor these tools to see if they're still performing as well as you hoped when you bought them or deployed them, because we've seen performance change quite a bit over time.
And thank you for that. And I think one question that comes to mind is, when we talk about starting to see tools from different vendors in the same environment, what is the state of interoperability? Are we at a point where practices can not think too hard about that, or are we in a position where we really need to start thinking more about our standards at this time? Especially if we're working with different vendors that may not have partnerships or collaborations, maybe they don't operate on the same platform. Dr. Kohli, would you like to start with that one?
Sure, yeah. Standards are always one of the things that I'm excited about. Well, I think that the standards really don't exist today in practice. I think that the IHE is really working hard on a couple of standards for artificial intelligence results. But today, as a part of the implementation plan that we have here at UCSF, we have to talk about, well, are you going to launch a viewer? Are you going to have, secondary capture? If that secondary capture is that going to go into the PACS, or is it just going to be stored for somebody else to see? Because patients can see all of the things that come into the PACS. And so what are the impacts of that? And, we're not even talking about radiologists editing results. That just, is a result coming in, static. So I'm really excited about the development of the standards, but the implementations haven't really started yet. So I think that we're still just really early in all of this, despite the fact that, AlexNet happened so long ago, and ImageNet and AlexNet. I still think we're just super, super early in all of this.
Drs. Mongan, Dr. Filice, is there any thoughts on interoperability?
I completely agree. I mean, I think that standards are essential. I think that one of the reasons why radiology has been so effective at digital health, and I would argue in many ways much more effective and much earlier than other areas of medicine, is because that the people, largely the people in the generation before the people that you see on this panel, really did some really hard work of defining good standards with DICOM, and then dragging the industry kicking and screaming into using them. And then eventually everyone in the industry realized, oh, this is actually really good. We're really glad we did this. But that there was a lot of work there that was both technical and political. And I think that's something that we need to replicate in this generation. We need to continue the good work that's already underway for defining new standards that we, using the existing standards where they work, building on those and creating new standards where we need them, and encouraging / dragging the vendors into using them. And I think, I totally agree with Mark that for the majority of AI use cases, particularly the sort of diagnosis decision support kind of applications, human in the loop, where you want to have interactivity, that the standards really aren't there yet. They're currently under development, and as Mark said, and haven't really been implemented. But it does vary a little bit by use case. So there are some use cases, for instance, AI image reconstruction, that happen on a scanner, where for that probably you don't really need much beyond DICOM for standards. And so, whereas there are other use cases where you might want to have interactive editing or revision of results. You click on a lesion and that causes the AI to evaluate that lesion, or you edit the segmentation in real time. For those kinds of things, even the standards that are currently under development may not really support that. So I think it's something that varies a little bit by use case in terms of how well supported by current or under development standards the AI interfacing is.
Can I just add one other thing? I think that there are a lot of places where we have existing exchange standards. So, there are DICOM SR objects that you can parse to create things, and, you can use DICOM SR to call your reporting system's API to put things in your reports. And so there are a lot of hooks and connectivity today. But I think that in addition to those sort of transport standards, I think we also need to create some semantic interoperability for the content that we're putting inside those transports. So I know that I've been working on a joint project with the ACR and the RSNA for a long time called the Common Data Elements. And the idea there is to create question and answer pairs that have individual identifiers that can give us those sort of semantic interoperability points.
Hey, Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about what semantic interoperability means?
Yeah, so thanks, John. I try not to talk too much, but it sounds like it's of interest.
That's what we're here for. This is perfect.
So semantic interoperability. So say, for example, that I'm reading a liver MRI. I'm an abdominal radiologist. Actually, so are John and Ross. So this is we haven't quite convinced Ali yet, I don't think, but that's okay.
This is unintentional, for the record. This is just a purely fortunate coincidence.
So say I'm reading a liver MRI and I have a LIRADS observation, and I want to be able to report discreetly, not only in my report for something that's human consumable, that the lesion is a LIRADS 5 lesion. But say that I also want to do some sort of alerting or some sort of decision support or some sort of follow-up in my electronic health record. The idea of semantic interoperability is that I can put in a concept into my report, like a LIRADS 5 observation. And when that flows electronically into the electronic health record, the electronic health record understands that same concept as a LIRADS 5 lesion and can do something else with it in a discrete way. And the common data elements allow us to do that in a way that's much more robust than just, say, putting the same string of characters into a report every single time. That's kind of like the easy or the low-hanging fruit way to do that, but that doesn't scale super well.
And so we have one question from our audience, but before we get there, just a quick question to follow up. Should our audience be requesting these standards in their RFPs, or is there anything else that you think we should be thinking about with the RFP? Maybe, I know we may be too early for our standardized operational log of events for the AI workflow. I think that's probably a discussion for another time, and hopefully we can take note for the future. But anything that you think we should be including in our RFPs, for example, any standards? And Dr. Filice, if you have thoughts on this, or Dr. Kohli or Dr. Mongan.
Well, yeah, I mean, just that, you know, actually, I'm thinking a little bit stream of consciousness here, but, you know, I don't know, it seems like a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Until the standards exist, you can't demand the standards. Until you start like actually requesting the standards, there's maybe less motivation to adopt the standards. And I don't know enough about the history of DICOM from, you know, the last generation on how that sort of happened. I expect it sort of happens, you know, or if it is to happen, it would happen sort of piecemeal both ways, right? So I think the work that the IHE is doing now to create some profiles that can help standardize some of the way that we, you know, hopefully we'll be using AI in the future. And as much as we can publicize it and get people familiar with it, then they can start asking about it. Because I think that is a really critical piece. Until people ask that of their vendors, they really will have, you know, very little motivation to do it.
Hey, Ross,
Yeah.
I wonder if, go ahead, John.
No, you go ahead.
I wonder if there's an opportunity kind of in this chicken and egg time period, because, you know, the software development lifecycle is pretty long. And so, you know, if you're saying, you know, I'm not going to buy this unless you've implemented IHE, you know, AIR, probably you're not going to buy it for a long time, right? But I think that one thing that you could do if you're going to make a purchase is to say that, hey, you know, we'll buy this today, we'll do a custom integration, but, you know, I need you, vendor XYZ, to really engage in the IHE process and start to put that on your roadmap, so that when I buy algorithm 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 with you, I'm not gonna be able to scale and redo this sort of custom integration that we have. And so those have to be standards based. And where you can put that in an RFP or write it into a contract as an obligation, I think that would really go a long way to getting the vendor community to engage with and support the development of standards.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, my understanding from talking to our forefathers and foremothers about how this played out with DICOM, and Ali, I think this is probably a bit of a leading question on your part, maybe knowing this, is, you know, what made DICOM a standard was lots of people saying, I'm not going to buy it unless it has DICOM on it. I'm not going to buy it unless it does DICOM. And so I totally agree with you, Ross. You can't demand that someone support something that doesn't exist yet. So we're in a little bit of an interim stage on that. And I think, Mark, you had some good strategies for addressing that. But as these standards start to exist, you know, what vendors are in a business, and the voice that speaks loudest to them is the voice of the next customer. And so when you are that next customer, if you say, I'm not going to buy it unless it has these standards, that vendor will support those standards.
I think this should be a call to action for our attendees. So please make note, and we'll be looking forward to you to lead this initiative. On that note, though, we do have an audience question that I really love. And I think this is something that's very personally of great interest and close to my heart. And so thank you, Jamal Willis, for this question. is training a system against bias an enforceable standard for vendors? And I think this gets at something really important, which is thinking about bias, as we mentioned, as you all mentioned in the paper. It can, the potential for AI models to exacerbate healthcare disparities in the training data sets upstream from the model itself. So again, is training a system against bias an enforceable standard for vendors? And Dr. Kohli, I'll turn to you for this one, if that's okay, to start us off.
So I think this is a really tricky one. So I think that there are a couple of things. I think that one of the problems that we run into is bias can be local and not necessarily something global. So I think that where bias, if bias were the same in different places, I think it would be easier to tell a particular vendor, hey, don't give me anything that's biased. The other thing that I would highlight is that, many other really, really, really bad bias things have not been discovered until after things have been implemented for a period of time and in use for a period of time. And I think that's where we've got monitoring, ongoing validation and monitoring so many times because, we just don't know what we don't know when it comes to bias. But I think that rather than telling them their product has to be bias-free, which I think is incredibly difficult, I think that at a very baseline, we need to have data sheets for models or data standards for models, such that we have detailed knowledge about the demographics, the features, the comorbidities, all of those things about the training data, because without that, there's no hope of ever really finding the bias. So until you run it on lots and lots and lots of patients. So I think that what you can require from an RFP perspective is detailed information about how the demographics and the characteristics of the training data.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think, that the important concept here is that bias is not a dichotomous thing. It's not like these models are biased and these models aren't biased. All models have biases in them. And so the question is, do the biases that are in this model, because all models are going to have bias, are they harmful in my patient population that I want to apply it to? And just as Marc was saying, there are a lot of biases end up being unintended consequences of how the model is applied. And so you can't ever anticipate all of the unanticipated consequences. You can try, you can think about it, and that's an important process, because the more time you put into thinking about it, the more of them you're likely to anticipate, but you're never going to anticipate everything. So I think that rather than thinking of this as there's a particular standard that we hold the vendors to, and then they get the check or they don't get the check, that we can say you passed or you failed, because that's not likely to be something we can reasonably enforce. I think it's all the things that Marc was saying. You evaluate your vendor on what they're doing to try to recognize and mitigate bias. So if you have a vendor and you start talking to them about, what are the demographics of your training set? What are the demographics of your validation set? Have you done stratified validation? Have you looked at how this performs, not just across the board, but specifically broken down by race, specifically broken down by socioeconomic status, specifically broken down by insurance status, by age category? If you've got a vendor who can answer those questions and who is thinking about those things and who has monitoring in place to look at stratified results, stratified monitoring. So not just, is it continuing to perform well overall, but is it, continuing to perform well overall, but all of a sudden it's working very poorly in Asians or in Asian Americans. Then that's what you want to look for. If you've got a vendor who says, well, we have a training data set, but it's proprietary where it came from, I can't tell you where it came from, and I can tell you that it's heterogeneous and has a representative mix of ethnicities and ages, but I can't tell you any more than that. That's likely to be a vendor where there, in my opinion, going to be more biases and more unintended consequences because they're not really looking. And if you don't look, you're not going to find anything.
Thank you. And Dr. Filice, any thoughts on this question as well?
I agree with much of what was said. I think it just is another reason why it's good to have a plan to monitor these tools after you buy them. So you can monitor for safety things and also for biases that might affect your patient populations.
And so let me ask you another question then. Do we have options for sandbox models? And when I say sandbox, I mean a practice environment, a test environment where you can bring the model in and see how it performs on a sample of maybe de-identified patient data from your institution prior to purchasing the solution. Is that something that's happening? Is this something that's maybe been thought of, or are we still not at that stage yet? Or should we be at that stage?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things that can be done there. One is, and I think this is what you're alluding to, is a evaluation on a retrospective data set. So, I'm thinking about putting in a model that evaluates for pulmonary embolism. I pull a bunch of CT pulmonary angiograms from my archive. I run it through the model and look at how it performs. Other things that can be done are more prospective. So oftentimes a model can be set up and run prospectively on studies, but it can be run in a way where the results are never seen by anyone. Sorry, or never seen by any of the people reading the studies, never seen by the radiologist. So they're only sort of monitored by the informatics or IT team that's looking at it. Or they can be set up such that only a select group of people who are kind of participating in the evaluation or the validation see those results, and they're maybe instructed not to influence their clinical reports by it, to write their clinical report first before looking at that. I think that one of the things that's important to keep in mind when you are doing this is that the number of studies that you need to run through a process like this to have statistically significant results with confidence intervals that are narrow enough to be meaningful is oftentimes larger than people would expect. So, if you, for instance, have an algorithm that claims to have 95% sensitivity for some finding, and you want to say, and you want to make sure that on your data, it has at least 90% sensitivity. If you run the numbers on that, you'll oftentimes find that you need a couple hundred positive and negative studies to run through it to have the lower end of your 95% confidence interval be at 90%. So I think that these are things that can be done. I think that these are things that are important to be done and should be done. But I think it's also important to do statistics around these just the same way you would do on any sort of research process, so that you understand what the confidence intervals are around the amount of data that you've been able to check, and don't fool yourself into thinking that, for instance, you've run a dozen studies through it and you agreed with all those, and so that's a full clinical validation of the system in your environment, and you don't really need to think about anything else.
Yeah, and John, to that point, something even less than that, just, well, man, I saw it at the demo at RSNA and it looked really great because it got all those cases right. I'm a little concerned that is what is that and other demos are really what are driving people to make these purchasing decisions. Another thing that I've been a little bit scared about is people kind of misunderestimating or misunderstanding the role of the FDA in these sorts of things. Because I think many times people will conflate what you're talking about, John, which is saying that this is going to work with the same sensitivity and specificity that's reported in the literature or from the vendor. It's going to work with that in my place. That I think is what people think that FDA approval means. when really what FDA approval means in this space is that there was a scientifically valid process that calculated those, sensitivity and specificity numbers, and that they, were appropriately powered and those sorts of things. But that doesn't really address whether that algorithm will work in your environment as claimed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're starting to see some reports of FDA cleared, people doing post-deployment analyses on the performance of FDA cleared products. There was at least one that I saw at the SIM conference that just concluded, where they're seeing that oftentimes the performance is much lower in their environment than what had been touted by the vendor, like a drop of sensitivity from 95% to 50%.
And so speaking of, and thank you, I think that those are absolutely imperative considerations. And I think the idea of what constitutes FDA approval and this total product life cycle are still such new concepts. And I'm sure we could talk about this for its own discussion. I will pivot just a little bit here on the topic of SIM. At SIM, we're starting to hear more about the cloud. And my question is, are there considerations that are unique to the cloud? And when we start talking about shifting, for example, our VNAs, our storage to the cloud, having our algorithms run in the cloud, are there any considerations maybe, and just off the top of my head, in terms of confidentiality and patient safety, anything that we should really be thinking about at this time? And Dr. Mongan, I'll ask you to start here if that's okay.
Sure, I always love to run my mouth. So I think that there are some particular considerations here. I think that the ones that people most often think about are the ones that you highlighted on security issues, patient safety issues. In my view, those are technically the least important issues, although oftentimes politically the most important issues. And I say that because I think that there's this tendency for all of us to think that, well, my little practice or my university or my imaging center is so small that no one outside of my area has really heard about it. We're not really on the radar in terms of someone trying to hack us or someone trying to break in or get our data. And I think one of the key lessons of information security of the past couple of years and all of the ransomware attacks that we've seen is that there is no imaging center, there is no private practice, there's no group anywhere doing anything medical that is too small to be, that it's small enough to be off the radar screen. Everybody is on the radar screen. Everybody is a potential target for attack. And so if everybody's a potential target for attack, then it's not like you're off the radar and you're kind of in stealth when you have something on premises, and then all of a sudden you increase your risk profile by going into the cloud. You already have that risk profile, whether or not you recognize that you do. So when you go to the cloud, what you do is you maintain a similar risk profile in terms of being a target for attack, but you go from having the couple of people who probably can only devote part-time in your institution to working on data security and information and network security to the very large, very professional full-time security team that cloud service provider has. So I think in general, you're likely to have better security for these things running in the cloud than you do for them on premises. That's not necessarily something that everyone recognizes. And so politically getting people to be comfortable with that is oftentimes a major consideration. I think some of the things that are real considerations, and this is some work that Marc's done a really great job of ensuring at UCSF, are if you're going to be clinically dependent on things running in the cloud, you need to make sure that your connection to the cloud is really solid. And in particular, if you're going to have mission critical things that you really can't do without, if those are the kinds of AI algorithms that you're deploying, you want to make sure that you have multiple physically independent paths to the cloud so that a single backhoe can't take you out. So, I think that that's a key consideration. Another consideration that may be worth looking at, generally isn't going to be a big deal, but if you have algorithms with use cases that are very latency sensitive, that need to be able to get the results back to you very quickly, you may want to look at the speed of your internet connection, the bandwidth, how long it takes to move the data to the algorithm and move the data back. Because for use cases that involve large volumes of data, if you have to move the whole study, all of the image data to the algorithm, and then get a lot of data back, it's possible that putting it in the cloud will increase that latency. If you have a very fast connection, or if you're working with algorithms that work on, that need to transfer smaller amounts of data, that may not be so much of a consideration.
Thank you. No, and I think it's so important to hear these perspectives, to think more broadly, as you mentioned, about factors kind of beyond those that we see at the forefront of our sessions and some of what we may see online as well. So thank you for clarifying those. I'm looking at our time. I'm going to take us all the way to 8 p.m. or to 9 p.m. Eastern, because I think this is a fantastic discussion. So more questions coming your way. Now, Dr. Filice, I would like to ask you a quick question here. We talked a little bit about soft return on investment, and even looking at factors like radiologist satisfaction, well-being, looking at patient report comprehension, looking at stability of contracts. Is this something that we should be asking for or looking at, or are we still focused, and should we be focused more on objective metrics such as report turnaround time, concordance rates between AI models and radiologists? And then I'll stop there. What are your thoughts on those soft ROIs and how we can approach measuring those?
Well, I think there's a million ways you can measure a million different tools. I mean, I think it's a lot of different metrics that are more important for some things and not so important for other things. I like the environment we're in because we're part of a healthcare system. I mean, many people are beginning to become, that kind of a practice. There's not that many independent radiology practices. So the thing I like about it is that we can take a little bit more of a holistic look at any kind of artificial intelligence we're looking at. So instead of just worrying about volumes or turnaround times or even, billing, you can look at, I guess softer things, but arguably potentially more important or just as important things like quality of care or morbidity and mortality or, other things that are really important, but that aren't as easy or as objective to measure. So I guess maybe hope that at least started to answer your question. I mean, I think there's a lot of different things you can measure, and I think every single tool and the combination of a tool with a practice, depending on what is their interest and what they're trying to accomplish, I think makes it can make it pretty unique in each particular situation.
Dr. Kohli or Dr. Mongan, any thoughts on how we can go back to our budget committees and really justify the expense of these AI models? Anything from your experience, anything that you're seeing in practice?
So I may be getting a little bit repetitious, but for me, it again comes back to that defining what your problem is. What's the problem that you're trying to solve? And I think that, to me, what budget committees want to hear is they want to hear a compelling story. So they want to hear a compelling story that resonates for them. And if they're a budget committee, what resonates for them is things that are going to save them money. So they want to hear a compelling story about what the problem is and why that problem is important to them, e.g., why that problem is costing them money. And then how this AI product is going to solve that problem. And ideally, how you can best measure that it's, the magnitude and the impact of that problem today, and the magnitude and the impact of that solution to that problem. But depending on everyone's a little bit different on this, depending on the committee and the thing, if you can make a really compelling argument for why this is a big problem that's costing them a lot of money, and why this AI solution is going to be effective in solving that problem, some things are hard to measure. And if you can, if you can explain why this is hard to measure, you may be able to get them on board, even with these sort of softer ROIs or more difficult to measure or more approximated metrics. I think if you can't put that story together of this is the problem, this is why it should be important and relevant to you, this is the solution, this is why it's going to work, and this is how I know, you're going to have a hard time getting support for buying things.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So John, I think that it's important that you just focus there on the cost and about cost cutting. Maybe you and Ross want to talk a little bit about whether you think that there's going to be increased revenue or, you know, say like new CPT codes for AI in the future and not new revenue.
So, sorry, go ahead, Ross.
Oh, I mean, definitely. Other than there are some CPT codes being developed for this, and so I think there will be, you know, I know of CPT codes in ultrasound and in breast that are being developed or being used or developed for AI tools, and I think that'll continue to occur to some degree. I mean, yeah, I guess is that what you're asking, Mark?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Mark, thanks for pointing out that I was overly focused on cost there, and I think that, you know, people are generally even more excited about driving revenue, increasing revenue than cutting cost. And both of those sides are things that are relevant to a budgeting committee. I think one thing that we have seen since we published this paper is we said in this paper that, you know, there aren't really any codes for direct reimbursement for AI, which I think was true at the time. But as Ross was describing, that's changed a little bit now, where we have a few things that are kind of direct reimbursement, and the one that's gotten the most press is the NTAP, the new technology add-on payment for large vessel occlusion stroke. It is important to recognize, and Mark, you've spoken eloquently about this in the past, that it's that payment and that revenue source is much more limited than it at first seems. It has a limited time period. It's actually fairly difficult to bill for. And in my personal opinion, I don't see direct payments because something is AI as a likely source of large amounts of future revenue for radiology. I don't think that in general, people are going to pay us for doing things because we're using AI. I think that the revenue is going to have to come from the value that AI provides. And I think that a lot of that will have to come from improved efficiency, which is a kind of a cost-cutting thing. I think that where there's additional revenue, I think that a lot of that is likely to come from doing things that we couldn't otherwise do. And one of the things that I'm excited about there is opportunistic screening of populations who are getting imaging for other reasons to find health conditions that they may not have known about, that might have gone on otherwise unrecognized. So one of the things that we put in at UCSF is an algorithm that can do coronary artery calcium scores opportunistically on any patient who's getting a non-con chest CT, even if that chest CT is non-gated, and potentially using that to recognize patients who have undiagnosed coronary artery disease. And then that's something that, you know, you can potentially generate more revenue for the hospital by treating those patients, and better patient outcomes by treating patients who otherwise, you know, would just be suffering with these risk factors and the potential downstream effects of those without having them treated or mitigated.
I think that's a really exciting front here. The idea of opportunistic screening, and then also of thinking about how AI can really extend to, I think, domains that we hadn't really thought about before. And for example, you know, non-interpretive use cases, ideas like resource optimization. How can we use models to identify to decrease idle time for scanners, and really to make sure that, you know, these purchased scanners are scanning and helping contribute towards revenue there as well. So I think that we have more exciting conversations on the way, and just great to see that we're kind of touching on everything here in our hour. 6 minutes left. I have one final question, and this is for everyone. We can start with let's say Dr. Kohli. We'll start with you, Dr. Mongan, and then Dr. Filice. If you could tell me, based on your experiences or anecdotally, 3 of the top individuals that you would want on your purchasing decision team, who would they be, and briefly why? We can do 2 or 3, just for time.
You mean people or roles? Like
Roles. Let's
individual
roles.
roles? So, and I'm assuming that I'm on the team as an
Hopefully.
informatics representative.
I'd hope so. I'd want you on my team. Let's say that.
So the first person that I would want is somebody who is an expert in that clinical scenario. And whatever that problem is that I'm trying to solve. So I absolutely need that sort of person. I think the other person that I would want, you said top 3, right?
We can do 2
That
or
in
3.
addition to me, or
In addition to you.
in addition to me. Okay, sorry, I'm
Let's go
negotiating
2 more
here.
in addition to you. Let's go with that.
All
One
right,
more.
so well, all right, I'm not gonna listen to you for a second, but so I'd want somebody
That's
who
okay.
is well-versed in the clinical area. I want an informatics expert. I would want somebody who understands a lot about patient safety and understands a lot about measuring risk and validation, like we talked about earlier. And then I'll just leave it to John and Ross and see if they come up with the last one that I really want to add.
So I think the person that I'd add to this, and I think I'm reading your mind here, Mark, is I'd really want to have someone from the imaging IT team, from the group that manages the systems that this is going to need to integrate with, because there are subtle differences in things that can seem like very subtle or inconsequential differences in the way that an algorithm might integrate with the existing environment that can cause wildly different costs and lengths of implementation that may not be immediately apparent to people who aren't working with those systems day to day. And so I think it's really important to have the people who are going to be responsible for actually implementing, integrating, and running these systems to be involved in that purchasing and evaluation process, or at least a representative of them. Did I get the right one, Mark? Oh no.
Oh, it's up to Dr.
I mean,
Filice.
that's a good one. And John, you usually read my mind. We work so much together, but I still have another one.
I would add a statistician so you can understand, I think a lot of the points John was making, really understanding the performance characteristics that are advertised by the vendor. And if you want to come up with any kind of plan to pilot those or test it or have a continuous monitoring program, really having someone who understands the performance measures and the power requirements to establish those at your own institution. That's what I would find very helpful.
Should we give Mark
So the
one
one-
more draft pick?
What's that?
Should we give Mark one more draft pick?
The last one is, and John, we haven't done this yet, but I think mostly because it's hard to find the right person to fill this role. But I think that we should put patients on our panels, and I think that we should, try to find a patient who this might apply to, and try to understand, what they want to know out of this implementation. But a lot of times I can rattle off a name for each of the other, things that John and Ross and I threw out there for all of those roles, except for the patient piece, right? The patient's piece is hard, but I think I'm going to challenge myself to do that in the future.
Yeah, I think that's an important voice to have. I think it's also a really difficult one. In my experience with putting patients on these kinds of things, there's sort of a group of professional patient advocates who I think are very well-meaning and well-intentioned and think that they represent all patients, but tend to be way, way, way out on the extreme and not very representative at all of the needs and resources and capabilities of the majority of patients. And so I think it's easy, if that's the only voice speaking for patients, it's easy to do things that serve that tiny slice of patients really well and actually are disservices to the majority of patients. So I think that's a really important voice. And I think it's really important how that's chosen, and difficult to choose that, because just like national politics, the people who most often want the job are oftentimes the most poorly suited for it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And I love that we're ending on that, because I think that should be the takeaway, that this is a patient-centric process. Everything that we're doing, these models that we purchase, it's to help radiologists, to help efficiencies, to help the department. But at the end of the day, I think we are really helping improve patient care. And I'd love that we can end on that. Dr. Mongan, Dr. Filice, Dr. Kohli, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute pleasure. I wish we had another hour. I really do. But hopefully we can continue this conversation on our online communities. And just for everyone here, Allison has dropped off a link in our chat box here for the Data Science Institute AI blog. So please join. If you're interested in contributing, reach out to us. And then just a reminder that the recording will be up on our RFS, that's Resident Fellow Section website, in the next day or two. And so keep an eye out. I'll be rewatching this for sure. Hopefully you will as well, and help us share this, our messages here. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good night, and looking forward to next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.